Hey guys, this is Kristen Martinez. I'm an expert in trauma-informed care, trauma-informed management, and trauma-informed business places, but this channel is really aimed for all of the therapists who self-identify as experts in trauma or who want to be trauma-informed, and for all my pre-licensed people who are struggling in agencies and just don't get good training or good information, or they just need a place to connect with other people who specialize in this area. And so today I'm talking about transgenerational trauma. You'll have also heard of it under its other names, such as intergenerational trauma. And there's another one, and I just forgot what it was, but that's okay. So transgenerational trauma. Oh, the transgenerational transmission of trauma. That's the third one I've heard it under. You may have heard of it under others, but those are my big three. And so one, I want to describe what it is. And it is the idea that a prior generation had a particular trauma that shows repeating in future generations. And we generally have thought that it's due to maybe because my great grandma hit my grandma, who hit my mom, therefore she hits me because that's how she was raised. But what we're actually finding is that it's not necessarily the nurture piece, which would be because my parent is a bad parent, therefore I'm a bad parent idea. It's the idea that the traumatic or toxic stress that was experienced by your grandmother when she was getting hit by her great grandmother produced a actual genetic change, which we can see through epigenetics, which is the study of how genes transmit. And so what they actually found is that high levels of toxic stress actually cause a genetic change. And because of that genetic change, they can track it. So epigenetics has been able to track in rats this gene related to trauma and traumatic stress, and that it passes on for 3 generations. So for example, grandma rat gets exposed to electroshock, right? Which changes her DNA. Everybody's DNA changes under toxic stress. Okay, then she gets pregnant with mommy rat, and mommy rat happens to get that gene passed down to her too. So now mommy rat is also responding to is also having a traumatic response to things that she actually never experienced herself. So maybe she's more hypervigilant. Maybe she has more difficult sleep. Maybe she has more difficulty concentrating. Okay, maybe she gets misdiagnosed with ADHD. Okay, so then mommy rat, who has this already genetic change to her DNA, passes it down to the 3rd generation in baby rat, who again begins to show those same difficulties. Now, it's not, you'd think, okay, that's great. Next generation, the gene goes away. This issue reverts back to normal. The issue with that is that if we apply the same thing to people, we have to realize that people are not in a controlled situation. So grandma rat may have experienced trauma that passed down to mommy rat, but then mommy rat has this trauma that's been passed down, plus she experiences additional trauma and passes that down. And we have it now extended a generation, and so on and so forth. And so you can really start to see how, I always say, look, I especially appreciate the perspective that transgenerational trauma and how epigenetics has come to explain it when we're working with people of color, because of the oppression that they experience. We have a better understanding of the severe traumatic experiences and responses and all of these negative outcomes, and how they're constantly being re-triggered and re-triggered and re-traumatized generation after generation. Okay, so the next part is, how do we start to explain to clients, and 2, assess for transgenerational trauma. Generally, when clients are coming in, they're asking us about and talking about their own problems, and sometimes problems with a parent. But rarely do we really get into generational issues. There are some great tools, which is a genogram. And I'm not talking about the way you used it in school, because in school you probably spent a whole half a class looking at it. Whereas when I'm talking about using a genogram and looking at past generations, it's a tool that could take months to actually use, to complete, really, because as you identify things in the family, you're also processing it at the same time. And again, it takes months to complete one in its entirety or entirety. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Okay, so that's a good way to like treat transgenerational trauma, right? Processing it, going through the genogram. Now, for me, I like to ask people their family stories. Like, tell me the story from all the family history that you've ever heard, and tell me it in a story. And then I can start to write red flags down, which is going to be in my guide to assessing trauma. So I start writing red flags down, right? If I hear immigration, I write that down. If I hear like people dying, I write that down. If I hear traumatic, historically traumatic things, war, veterans, Trail of Tears, I'm writing that down. And then I'm asking further questions after they've finished telling me their story. So I might say, "Wow, I heard that your great grandparents, they immigrated from Brazil, and that must have been traumatic. Can you tell me what that experience was like for them?" Great. Okay, that's my first follow up. My second follow up question is, "Wow, I wonder if that event has affected you and how you think about the world." And then I might ask, I'll even take it a step further. And after processing that question, I'll ask, how do you think, or do you think that that event might have affected your own, your own, not just worldview, but your own view of your purpose in life? Like, do you think that it affected the way you look at what your life is meant as? It's not just fascinating. Yes, it's fascinating from the academic standpoint and learning the information, but it's also so helpful for clients to see how they've been looking at the world, how it's been influenced by past generations. I also often will explain the effects of transgenerational trauma in this way. And I do use the Holocaust as an example because it's a highly charged emotional event that most people are aware of. And depending on your population and who you work with, you can change this event to any highly traumatic event that people will know about. So this is how I explain transgenerational trauma. I ask people to think about the Holocaust and to think about the survivors out of the Holocaust. And then I ask them, how do you think that was a lot of stress on the people? And how do you think it was for their children and their children's children? And then I will use this example and apply my questions to it, but more looking at it from like as an outsider. Like, do you think the most current generation has some of their identity formed around what happened to their family in the Holocaust? Do you feel like do you think that the Holocaust and what their family survived influences their view, the view of their world? If the world is a safe place, or if the world is a dangerous place, or if the world is filled with love, or the world is filled with hate? Do you think that experience of do you think that experience of the survivor has affected the family line at all? And then you go into how it might be healed, right? So one, awareness is definitely a healing factor, but then also looking at all of the ways that this event has affected the person and start to tease out what parts they like about it and what parts aren't very helpful for them. So that was me in a 10-minute description of transgenerational trauma. And as you can tell, I could probably go on with it for a really long time, which I could. But that was just a snippet. It's just a real quick rundown of what transgenerational trauma is and ways that you can start to look at it in the therapy room. This was Kristen Martinez. Good luck to all my trauma-informed therapists. And remember, I'm getting ready to do mine. Intentional self-care tonight, everybody. Intentional self-care. Thanks. This is Kristen.